Lutter. I'm a revitalization specialist with New York Department of State. We're joined today by my colleagues Melissa Keller, Pop Cisse, and Rachel Bruce. The application for the second round of New York Forward has been announced with $100 million available in funding. Like the DRI, New York Forward communities develop a strategic investment plan and compile catalytic projects that build toward a community vision for a revitalized downtown. As a reminder for those applying, here are important dates for this year's application. The applications are due via the CFA portal for all regions except New York City on September 29th at 4 p.m. For New York City, applications must be emailed to your borough president office by September 8th at 4 p.m. Applications cannot and will not be accepted after the deadline. These educational webinars aim to help future New York Forward communities understand the basics of downtown revitalization planning. Please note that these webinars were recorded last year and are currently available on the DOS website, but they include irrelevant references to previous dates and times. The relevant dates were just mentioned. Again, September 29th, 4 p.m. for the application statewide, September 8th at 4 p.m. for New York City, and there is a recorded webinar dedicated to the application process that has been posted on the New York Forward Capacity webinar website. Last Thursday, we talked about project development, and today we'll talk implementation, how to organize partners, avoid pitfalls, how to shepherd a project through the approval process, and more. So with that, I'll share our screen. We have a relatively short video today in comparison to last week's, so a reminder to put any questions you have into the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Just joining us, but these are what we have been going through week by week of the steps of accomplishing our, our revitalization process. So we started way back a few weeks ago talking about visioning, talking about the public outreach process that creates that vision. We discussed the importance of engagement, and we talked about how to leverage existing community networks and maximize public input. And then we began to move into learning how to find all the data, the resources, and the information that we might need to conduct a community needs assessment. And that was helping us assess and further refine the input that we received from our public. And then through that qualitative information of the engagement process, in conjunction with the quantitative information of the community needs assessment, we started to talk about goals, the goals that would help us and our community measure our progress. And we could make adjustments to those goals if needed as time went on. And goals, then our community began to develop placemaking and revitalization strategies that provide specific steps on how to achieve those goals. And then we finished last time diving more deeply into the variety of projects that are possible that make that vision of our placemaking goals and strategies possible. So now here we are, and we're going to dive into implementation. We're going to talk about where do we start, who do we need as our partners, and what are the variety of elements and strategies needed to help move this plan forward so that it does not sit on a shelf. That is the last thing we want, is for you to have a revitalization plan that sits on a shelf. So how do we keep it active and how do we keep it alive? So before we get too deep into implementing fully those projects that we want to see in our revitalization plan, I think there's a nice first step that helps us show support of the plan, helps us sort of take a moment to ensure that we are politically ready to move forward. And we can do this simply by adopting a legislative policy statement or a resolution of support for our revitalization plan. Is this statutorily needed? No. But the reasons behind it is that what we're trying to do is show to our community, show to the development world, and most importantly, show to funding sources that will help us, again, make those projects come to life, that we are ready to move forward and that we have support and that we have political support. And again, all around pursuing our next steps. So the resolution doesn't have to be anything too specific regarding some of the maybe the goals and projects that you have in mind, but instead it can begin to highlight the process that you took. So maybe you just have simply a whereas clause that talks about, you know, some of the public engagement that you led and those types of initiatives. You can have a clause that talks about maybe some of the placemaking goals and strategies if you'd like. And then the resolution could even go as far as beginning to authorize your staff to take maybe those necessary steps to move the plan forward, right? And to show then that you are ready and to move forward in pursuing funding. And all of those could be, you know, small whereas clauses within this resolution of support. And then your town, your village, or if you're a city board can adopt that resolution of support to show that, again, we're all on this same mind step, and we can move to some of our next steps together. Another sort of pre-step, I would call it, and it sort of brings us back to, I think it's webinar 1 and maybe webinar 3, but is this idea of our comprehensive plan. And the reason I raise this is because it is now that we need to consider whether or not our comprehensive plan needs an amendment to it. Now, ideally, if you have a comprehensive plan, this is, right, that your comp plan speaks in its language to the goals and the actions desired in your revitalization plan. However, we certainly know that there are communities that have very outdated comprehensive plans that might not speak now to the visions that you and the goals that you perceived within your revitalization plan. And if that's the case, right, and we sort of did that assessment, I think, again, Kevin talked about this, when we were looking in our fridge, we were gathering all the different plans and all the different studies that we had. I think as you were assessing that, as you were looking at those documents, you probably began to see that your comp plan might not speak to some of these ideas of revitalization, and you took note of it. It's now's the time then to probably amend that comprehensive plan. So again, take a quick look at your comp plan, see if it has the language that is needed, because as you're moving forward, and specifically as you're trying to think about those zoning changes that are on your mind, or the land use regulations that have to be changed in order to, again, create that revitalization plan and idea that you have, all of those actions must be in conformance with the comprehensive plan. And that's, legally, they need to be in conformance with your comprehensive plan. So this is really important that you take the time to look and make sure that your comprehensive plan speaks to those goals and strategies. So this could be, again, a quick tweak to amend your comprehensive plan regarding this. If you don't have a comprehensive plan, maybe the revitalization plan is the beginning or the start of the development of your comprehensive plan. And so again, just making sure that we are looking closely at this document and making sure that, again, our public welfare is being served by our land use regulations all through an updated comprehensive plan. So we want those two documents to work hand in hand together. It's very important. And again, maybe this revitalization plan, if it triggers an amendment to a comprehensive plan, maybe it also triggers a larger undertaking of your comprehensive plan, sort of the first step in updating that comprehensive plan. So good opportunities all around to sort of check in here. And another step prior to really getting into implementation, but again, this I think helps you strategically move the document forward, is you want to keep it alive. We were talking about it not sitting on a shelf. So after you've done all this public engagement and participation, and as you've engaged your staff and partners and board members in conversations about your downtowns, you want to come back to people. So you want to put your plan out on the website. You want to maybe email it to those that participated in the process. You could put it up on social media. Most importantly, I think you want to share it with your land use boards, your committees, your staff, to make sure that everybody, again, is working in lockstep together. And Jess will talk a little bit more about that in terms of even streamlining our process, is ensuring that everybody's sort of on that same page. And then disseminating it again through our community groups and our partners. And maybe we hold another meeting where we talk about the plan to everyone and how we're going to implement the plan. It's great to just, again, come back to our public, come back to our community and say, here's what's next. This isn't just a plan, again, that's going to sit on the shelf. Here's how we're going to move it forward. And here are the steps that we're going to take to move it forward. And finally, and most importantly, just like we talked about during our public engagement seminar, webinar, we talked about the fact that someone needs to coordinate this full revitalization effort. So maybe that's the same person who is helping you coordinate your public participation plan. But if you don't have a planner, all right, that is keeping their eye on the ball regarding this revitalization plan, then who else can you look to? And we have seen communities that have used possibly their chief elected official to shepherd the process. We've seen town and village board members step up to do that. We've seen administrators within the community take that role on, and we've even seen building inspectors and engineers take that role on in smaller communities. So again, look to your citizens, look to the leaders internally. And again, one person should probably be designated as that coordinator of the revitalization plan to help move it forward, to help coordinate the larger groups, to keep thinking about the variety of ongoing projects, thinking about the funding sources, so on and so forth. And so again, you can find someone internally that serves that role. And we've seen as well communities use committees. They're called implementation committees, where it's made up of a few members of a group. And again, each of them sort of takes on a task or a role to help, again, move that plan forward. So these are the things we're thinking about. Again, all the steps I'm just talked about are things that help, I think, keep your plan alive and well, and keep it in front of everybody. And again, the more you do that, the better for, in terms of its full implementation later on. So now we're going to dive into the implementation piece, right? How do we implement this plan? Who's going to do this? What are some of the projects involved within it? And how do we accomplish it? And so I'm going to turn it to Kevin now, who's going to start with our who, and talk about our what, and then move to our how. So Kevin.
All right, so Tiffany talked about the coordination of the overall project, or rather the overall plan. But as you recall from us having gone in previous webinars through placemaking strategies, through project development, through plan formation, your revitalization plan is really a bundle of projects. And so who's going to manage those projects? Who is your key implementer of those projects? And then who might be your implementation partners? In an ideal universe, you would have a planning director, and that planning director or the accompanying planning staff with training in planning and implementation would shepherd the projects that fall under the purview of your locality. But if you're a small community and you don't have planning staff, or if your county is unable to provide you with that capacity, then you might be able to draw upon administrative staff to help lead certain projects. You also could tap consultants and other technical advisors, whether they be engineers or architects or planners, and enlist them to project manage some of the actions within your plan. Don't forget that not all of your projects in your revitalization plan are going to be sponsored by the locality itself. Some of your project sponsors might be community organizations, or they might be private developers. They might be other localities. So with each sponsor, they're going to bring their own bundle of staff members who are going to facilitate the implementation. Your committees are unlikely to lead a project. They can facilitate the overall coordination of the revitalization plan, but your committees are important for check-ins. They are your implementation partners, whether it's an environmental project that you are coordinating with the Environmental and Sustainability Committee, or a redevelopment project that you are conferring with your land use or your economic development committees. Projects, especially complex projects, cannot be done alone just by the locality. You're going to have other partners. It might be a hospital, it might be a university, it might be other state agencies who are there to provide you with permits. It could be your neighbors, neighboring localities who share a resource or share a road with you or share a park with you, and they become involved too. And then finally, there are the elected officials who are valuable in smaller communities. They may have a lot of energy and willingness to help you with the implementation side. And I would encourage you to draw upon those resources of your elected officials. But I would also say to be judicious about distinguishing between your actions, which are purely administrative, and your actions which really require the legislative approval and monitoring from your elected officials. So use your elected officials, but use them wisely. Use them as receivers of information, as distributors of information, and as approvers for actions that require determinations from the legislative bodies. Let's talk about what. What is the revitalization work plan? When you developed all those projects and you created descriptions of those projects and you plugged them into your revitalization plan, you might have ended up with a beast of a document. And you have seen some of our links and suggestions of other revitalization plans to look at, and you'll see that some of them are rather voluminous. It's easy to get lost in all of the maps and the existing conditions background. What you really need is a to-do list, and a detailed one that's easy to understand, that's clear, that everyone can be on the same page with. And so what's in that work plan? Well, the work plan is going to have a few components. Clear description of the proposed action, documentation of why that action is going forward, what were the goals you were trying to achieve, the designation of the responsible parties for implementation, as I had suggested below, clear articulation of the implementation steps. We're going through, sequentially what you need to do from A to Z, and then a prioritization of the projects, showing which ones can be done in a year, which ones can be done in 2 to 3 years, which ones are going to take longer. And that prioritization piece of your work plan is there to make sure that you can identify your early wins, the smaller projects that you can get done within a year. And also, it helps you to figure out which projects are synergistic, which ones need to be done concurrently. Here's an example of a revitalization work plan. And this came out of a revitalization plan for Ardsley, and specifically for its downtown. It was just completed earlier this year. I put the link on the slide so you can take a look at it. But the matrix in front of you illustrates all those subcomponents of a work plan for a revitalization initiative. You've got an action description. You have a reminder to self about the comprehensive planning goals that are being addressed here. The designation of the implementation parties. In this case here, this is a community where we had suggested they don't have a village planner, but we had advised them to try and get one and to secure the funding for one to move these forward, and they were receptive to that concept. As Tiffany mentioned, for smaller communities where you do not have a planner or the possibility of one, then you're going to tap in to that broader range of implementation parties to help you to keep moving things forward. There are the implementation steps telling you how do you get from A to B. And then on the right hand is the phasing, which stage within the process does that particular action fall? Now let's shift to talking about the how, right? We know who is coordinating your project and who are your implementation partners. We've got a work plan, so we've got the what covered. Now, how do we actually do the implementation? And there's a few pieces of this. I'm going to start by talking about the funding side. So when you reach the implementation stage, this is not the first time that you are thinking about the project's funding. You've been thinking about the funding for the project from the very beginning. You might actually be developing a project because you had some available funding in the first place. But when you get to the completion of a revitalization plan, you're going to have to dive in deeper into your funding strategy. Because the reality is that you probably have a multiplicity of sources that you contemplated and felt some were a sure win, some might be a far reach, and some are likely, right? And when you get to the implementation stage, now you actually have to do the hard work of securing that funding. So let's break it down a bit. You're going to look at all your different sources of public financial sources, right? So that's your revitalization programs like DRI or New York Forward. You're going to look to see all your development finance programs, whether they be state or federal programs that are designated for facilitating economic development or studying the feasibility of a site or financing housing. You're going to work with your finance departments or with your local or county IDA to think through how a redevelopment project might be moved forward financially through tax abatements or through pilot agreements. And you're also going to look through the guidelines and the eligibility requirements for federal monies, whether they be community development block grants or some of the transportation monies that are available for infrastructure improvements. But whatever you find out from your public finance sources as being appropriate and likely and viable and competitive for those programs, it's very likely you're still going to have to deal with some type of local budgeting as well, some sort of allocation from your own budgetary sources. And there's a few reasons for this. One of them is a lot of the grant programs might be more focused on funding capital costs, but they might not give you the funding for additional planning, or for once the project is built, you may need more funds to cover the operational and the maintenance costs associated with that project. A lot of grants have match requirements. So you might need to dig into portions of your local budget in order to ensure that a funder's match requirements are there. And lastly, you might have projects in your revitalization plan which you just didn't know how to fund, and they didn't fit in easily into any of the programs that are currently available, or they weren't completely ready, but you know they're important, and they might be long-term infrastructure projects. And those are projects that even if they're currently unfunded, you're going to want to include them in your long-term capital plans. So that's an important step to take in this process. As a locality, you were also going to be involved in the private finance pieces. Some of your projects, the sponsors might be private developers, and they may be trying to achieve financial closure with banks or community lending institutions. And part of the process of them securing that funding is interdependent on your own success as a locality at being able to help capitalize those projects, or help to show the business case for those projects, or alternatively to provide critical inputs regarding the financial models for the projects, whether they be the costs or the revenue generation or the tax revenue collected. There's lots of different ways where you as a locality can be supportive to your private developers even if you yourselves are not borrowing the funds. You might also be working with philanthropic or corporate foundations to get them to provide you with some funding for some of your actions. And then the last piece here on the how are crafting your partnerships. And we've talked about this a few times over the course of this series. The ways in which you can't do this alone, and some of your greatest partners financially might be your anchor institutions, such as your universities or your hospitals. You might be working with a local development entity like a land bank that can access funds that you are not able to access as a locality. There may be community organizations. A good example is Philmont Beautification Incorporated in Columbia County that was able to take the lead on securing a range of different funds over the last several years and move forward on a community-based revitalization strategy. Or it might be business associations. They may take the lead in securing funds or collecting money. I'm talking about chambers or bids, or they may already have some grants that they can allocate towards some of the projects that are inside of your revitalization plan. On the right of this slide, I offer you a few links to different sources that I have found useful in terms of being able to find out the funds that are available through New York State, the different housing programs, some of the innovative techniques for redevelopment finance. And then lastly, I have a link there for programs from the federal government, especially those coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, that are really suitable for rural communities, for smaller communities. And it includes like deadlines and links so that you can find out more about those programs for smaller communities. Also under the how is complying with SECRA, and that's the State Environmental Quality Review Act. This is the act that requires localities to evaluate the environmental impacts of certain kinds of actions. And there's a lot of different ways that that analysis or assessment can be done. There are different types of actions which trigger different types of analysis, different factors that need to be considered. And there's a lot to learn on this process. But at the stage of the implementation of the revitalization plan, I would say that there's probably sort of 3 threshold considerations. The first one is, are you going to conduct an environmental impact analysis for your entire revitalization plan, the umbrella for all of your different actions? You might, if it's a zoning that encompasses a large part of your downtown or a major redevelopment project and lots of infrastructure changes that are interdependent. Undertaking a broad environmental impact review and a robust one for an area can make a lot of sense. It might streamline the approval and development readiness of other projects within that revitalization plan. But maybe your plan is not so development or infrastructure focused, or maybe it's not a full-scale rezoning. Maybe it's 1 or 2 smaller buildings being adaptively reused with minimal zoning changes, or the bulk of the changes are more of a softer intervention in nature. Maybe they're operational or managerial changes. And so rather than evaluating the environmental impacts for the entire plan, you might actually do it more on a project by project basis. The last consideration I want to leave you here with is to be judicious about when you undertake the SECRA process. You want to make sure your project is ready. In a way, kind of like funding, the environmental impacts of a project are something that you have been thinking about all the way along, from the beginning stages of project development, thinking through how is this project going to affect the environment. But what you might not have done is engage the consultants or conferred with the attorneys to navigate through the full SECRA process, following the trail on this flow chart on this slide. And I would say to you, before you invest resources in the analysis, make sure your projects are ready. Make sure you've thought them through a bit. And then when you're ready, that's the time where you begin to think about what's my strategy? Do I look at the full plan? Do I look at this on a project by project basis? Am I far enough along that I'm ready to move forward on the environmental impact review? So we're going to move on now to the next part of how that Jessica is going to address. But before I turn it over to you, Jess, I just wanted to show you that we put in a few links here on resources that you can use to navigate the secret process and learn a bit more about some of the fundamentals required for completing an environmental review for a project like one that might appear in your revitalization plan.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So in the how, it's very important for us to recognize and deal with the approval process. So whether you're a community who approves, through your land use approval process, dozens of projects or, in a month or a handful in a year, you need to anticipate this potential increase in projects coming through the process and be prepared. And also there are projects that you're planning for and encouraging. So you want a system in place that also is clear and streamlined. So when we're looking at the plan and this work plan that Kevin just discussed, and we're looking more specifically at the projects, we want to start thinking about which ones are going to make their way through the process, what steps and approvals are going to be needed, who might be involved, and whether your process is in good shape and prepared to kind of take on that approval process. And so when doing that, we also need to be thinking about which of those projects are consistent with zoning and which might trigger some type of zoning change. So I want to talk a bit about both of these, starting with the local approval process. So when we work with communities, you'll see that we have a checklist of different options that we look at. And so when we talk about streamlining, again, we need to understand kind of the current process and how we might improve that process. I'm guessing if I could do a show of hands in the room, if we were all together and ask you, how many of you feel like your process is streamlined and clear and consistent and easy for somebody to come in and figure out? Probably not many of you would put your hand up, right? If we asked your customers, your land use applicants, to review the process, what kind of reviews would you get? And so thinking about that, and again, thinking about maybe putting more projects through that process is really what we want to talk about now. And so I have a checklist here of assessing the process, simplifying, clarifying, providing more guidance through pre-application consultation, maybe even having a fast track, and again, making sure our local boards are prepared and trained to take on maybe this new additional activity as well coming through your land use approval process. So let's go through and take a look at each of these kind of steps and how we might review and improve our land use approval process. So one, don't go out and do all these things. Don't feel like you need to do them all. But you do need to take a moment to really think about what that process looks like and how you can help build a better process and therefore encourage this type of development that you're looking to encourage and plan for in your community. And so this is something you can kind of put on the table to make that revitalization happen. So maybe you don't have a lot of, funding, to put on the table, but this is something you can bring to the table, because the longer projects are in the approval process, the more uncertain the outcomes, the more costly those projects are. So assessing the current process. So there's all different ways to do this. Some are very time consuming, some pretty simple, depending on the number of boards and staff, will really dictate the amount of time. So who do we need to talk to? Who has information? Staff, secretary to boards, board members themselves, past applicants. These are all the folks you really need to get information from to different varying degrees, depending on your time and resources, to really come up with recommendations on how you might improve your process. This could be as simple as just going and talking or hosting a meeting with the chairs and secretaries of your boards in a smaller community. This could be more involved, or you have one-on-ones with multiple staff people and chair people and separate boards as well. You could put together surveys, you could reach out to past applicants, you could bring everybody together, right? So there's different ways you can do this depending on, how much time you have and how involved the process is. If you're sitting there saying, we only saw a handful of projects, last year in total, maybe this process isn't as involved, and maybe it's a matter of you taking a look at the web page, the process, the forums, designating someone to do this. So a lot of different ways to approach this, but again, it's really just gathering information about how the process is working and learning a bit about that. Once you know that, it's likely that some of that feedback will indicate that the process is maybe overly complicated, and there might be ways to simplify the process. I often talk to communities about this and I say, well, I noticed that you have this requirement for all these copies, or this requirement to fill in the same information 10 times. And I ask communities why, and I almost always get the answer, that's the way we've always done it, right? So this is the time to say, is the way we've always done it the right approach, or should we make a change? Could we simplify the process? If we simplify the process, it's not only going to make it easier to implement and more efficient for applicants, it also will for your volunteer board members and the staff and consultants involved in that land use approval process. So this is something that you could look at as a kind of a local efficiency project, a cost saving initiative, to undertake a review and analysis of the process and simplify and make sure that you are creating efficiencies. This could be kind of in the requirements, the forms, the information. Are you duplicating efforts? And also, could you do coordinated board reviews? Are board meetings happening in a way that's not sequenced well, or in kind of sequential versus where there could be overlapping efforts? Maybe some board members can be attending other board meetings. So there's different ways to coordinate. There's different ways to reduce requirements. I'm not saying not to do things that need to be done in order to meet the requirements of your land use goals and regulations, but I'm saying, think about, are you just doing things because that's the way you've always done it? Maybe now's the time to rethink that. And that's, again, a cost saving measure that communities can undertake, and also prepare for implementation of those revitalization projects. All right, so what else? Clarify. So again, if I were to poll everybody or do this survey or talk to past applicants and I said, how clear was the process? What kind of feedback would I get? And I will tell you, as somebody who looks at the land use process in a lot of communities, almost every single one I go to look at, I'm like, well, where do I begin? What do I do? I'm confused. And I feel like I have, a pretty good background expertise in looking at land use requirements. So if I'm confused often, probably a lot of your applicants are as well. So clarifying that process, how do we do that? You don't need to do all these things. These are just some things that communities have done. They've created guidelines. They've created FAQs. They've created glossary of terms. They've created things like you see on the screen, like a simple flow chart, where you're going to go. They put information about the expectation of time. How long is this going to take? If you set those expectations, it's easier for applicants to kind of navigate and set out the right amount of time and expectation versus kind of feeling like it's a prolonged process. But there are legally required steps that take time. And if they know that up front, it helps smooth the way for that process. Clear application materials, right? What zoning district are you in? Seems like a very simple question. Well, maybe we could put a link for where to find that information for kind of our lay applicants who may not know. So there's different degrees of familiarity and expertise involved. Probably on our larger scale projects, we definitely will have applicants that have much more experience. But just in thinking about our land use approval process, clarifying that process, providing guidance where you can. I know sometimes it's costly or hard to have a lot of online resources, but where you can, again, have online resources, have clear materials with guidance, have roadmaps and flow charts where you can as well. So whenever you can help applicants kind of understand the process, do that, clarify. So we want to simplify, get rid of extra steps, and we want to clarify what needs to be done. So, and some communities go as far as having pre-application consultations. These can take many different forms. They can be required, they can be voluntary. So it could be something you're offering to applicants early in the process. Really great, as many people you can get around the table, chairs of different boards, consultants, officials, set those expectations early, deal with any kind of confusion or conflicts early on, lay out that process with them. So you really kind of can hit the ground running. Again, we see communities do this, as a required step. Some do as a voluntary kind of service that they offer. Some do simple things like informationals. This is the process you're going to have to undertake, and they charge a small fee for that because it takes staff time to give that information, and applicants can come forward and ask for that. So again, there's different ways to do this. They could be educational sessions that you just host and they're kind of an open forum for potential applicants to come forward. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prepare the community for an increased number of applications based on specifically the projects you're anticipating moving through the implementation process as part of your work plan, you know, coming out of your revitalization planning effort. So another option here is that we actually have seen communities specifically fast track projects. You know, they set out certain categories and criteria and they say, you know, these projects are fast tracked. They go early on agendas, they go to the top of the pile, they have, you know, they meet certain requirements. We've seen this for affordable housing or green projects or certain projects. So there are ways to actually build in, you know, for particular projects, kind of a priority status that, you know, meets, you know, your goals for your community, and you want to help these projects, you know, through that process as quickly as possible to get them kind of into that building stage. And so this might be also important, you know, depending on funding sources and timing and sequencing and synergies of projects to really time that out and know by using some type of possible fast track option. All right, and then who's making decisions? You know, the local board. So, you know, we have training requirements, you know, in New York State. And again, maybe you're in a community where your board members have only seen a handful of projects or only see a handful of projects in a given year, and they might see a lot more. They might see a lot more complicated projects than maybe what they've seen previously. So any time that you can help to prepare the boards by offering training, and the more that you can host that training, arrange that training, identify that training. So they're not maybe getting the training on the things that you don't think are going to be as helpful, but really kind of guide them towards specific training is another way to tackle this. So, you know, 4 hours of training, great thing. It's great that it's required in our state, but the more you kind of look at this specifically with the target of preparing them for the projects that are going to come through and maybe some changes that they need to be aware of, or even specifically training on the revitalization plan, what it says, what the goals are, what the type of development is, and how that relates to their roles and responsibilities is, you know, another way to kind of tackle this. So you think about that as an opportunity, the board training requirement and how you might kind of help to equip your land use boards to respond to these projects as they come in. And I would encourage you to not only have, if you host something, those board members, but any staff or board secretaries or other folks in your community that are involved in that process. Because the more that everybody's on the same page, the more you can streamline that effort. So we now have kind of the zoning piece here. And you see on the slide, you know, lots of technical details. So when we're thinking about these projects, and we've heard, I think Kevin and Tiffany both brought up kind of in the process, you know, zoning, and zoning must be in accordance with our comprehensive plan. And we have now planning that we're looking at the synergies with our comp plan, but we need to really think about these projects. Do these projects trigger, you know, full rezonings, minor zoning changes? You know, what exactly are we dealing with? And so if we don't make those changes, you know, could applicants go forward and request variances? They could. Could that be very time consuming? Yes. Is there, depending on, you know, if it's an area versus a use variance or the type of variance, is there a likelihood that maybe they wouldn't even be able to get those variances? Probably. So, you know, thinking through the zoning and whether your zoning lines up with the projects or whether there might be zoning changes that are needed is a really key step to think about early in the process. And again, are we talking about additions of a use to a particular district or significant changes in the bulk and area requirements of districts? Or should we be thinking about kind of flexible zoning tools? I could do an entire training with you on different tools. So I'm just going to throw out some different tools to be thinking about, but there's things like floating zones, where the zone is floating and adds additional uses or bulk and area standards or requirements when certain criteria are met in certain areas. So overlay, where we're overlaying, you know, to our zoning, maybe additional uses or requirements. Incentive zoning, you know, if we give you additional density in exchange for these types of things we're looking in the projects, There are incentive zoning tools, and then form-based codes, where we kind of move away from our traditional zoning approach and we think more about the form of the development, what we're looking to do, and less about the uses. So there's a lot of advanced and flexible zoning tools that could be looked at that helps to move us towards maybe the zoning that's needed. But really the point here of not trying to jam a lot of zoning information kind of to you very quickly is to think about the zoning. If we're thinking about streamlining, we're thinking of project approval, this is a big piece, because her communities kind of look at downtown revitalization projects, and one of the projects alone needed 96 variances. After rezoning was done, there was 1 or 2 minor variances that were needed. Now imagine that project trying to get through that approval process with the old zoning versus the new zoning. Not streamlined, likelihood of a positive outcome very low, a lot of issues there. So zoning is one of our key components of streamlining, and again creating that kind of connection back to our planning documents, and specifically our comprehensive plan, is essential through all of this. So you know, streamlining the how, getting our projects through that process is a big thing to think about, but a key role of the local government in thinking about that. All right, so you made your way through the revitalization plan implementation effort, right? And all the steps that Tiffany talked about making sure it's out there and available and recognized, and then specifically implementing it with a work plan and identifying responsible parties, funding, getting it through the approval process, as Kevin discussed. Now what? What happens, right? We have that all in place. Are we done? Do we just, it finishes? Nope. It's more of a cyclical process. It's not linear, right? You're not going to just get to it. You need to keep revisiting. You need to keep monitoring. You need to look annually at kind of what projects have been completed, which ones have encountered barriers, you know, what those barriers are. Do we need to pivot or recalibrate something? You know, are we seeing a lot of synergy around a particular set of project initiatives? So should we kind of reprioritize in some way? So again, we need to monitor the projects, do some type of annual review to see what's working and what's not working, and then come up with those plans and tweak those plans and keep everything moving forward. So moving around that circle and keep going. Downtown revitalization does not happen overnight, and it definitely is not going to happen in 1 year. I mean, this is planning and redevelopment efforts, depending on the scale of the projects, that could be 5+ years down the road to get through it all. So we need to keep looking year to year at what's gotten done and kind of reimagine what we need to do to kind of move to the next piece. And again, look for those synergies and keep getting those low-hanging fruit projects done where we can. All right, so here's really where we've been, right, over the last, if you've spent the end of your summer into the early kind of September with us, you can kind of see where we started back, you know, visioning, right? Tiffany and I talked to you a lot about visioning, and developing this revitalization planning process, how we engage our community, then how we come in with data analysis and community needs assessment to then bring those two pieces together and identify goals and strategies around placemaking strategies, and then getting more specific about those actual projects that we're looking to implement. And then implementing all of it, right? Having that revitalization plan, having it in place, acknowledging it, working through the specific projects, and then implementing those specific projects, you know, through responsible parties, funding, the approval process that we just wrapped up, and then keeping that cycle going, revisiting and moving it forward as you look at new funding opportunities. So whether you're undertaking any of this as part of a specific funding application, or you're looking to apply for the DRI or New York Forward this year, next year, and a future year. But this is really, you know, this planning process is the basic planning process that we've outlined here. And then looking at kind of this through the lens of those different funding processes is and requirements is another layer. So I know we had a question earlier about kind of the responsible parties and consultants and communities that don't have a lot of resources. And yeah, through these funding streams, you can tap into kind of adding to your capacity because they help to fund some of that. So I encourage you to kind of circle back to I posted earlier in the chat the resources that are specific about those grant programs and how they work and how they connect with consultants to help with planning and other grant programs for that matter. There are funding sources out there through the consolidated funding application that Kevin mentioned and other sources of funding that specifically can help fund if you need to do zoning updates and things like that. So the important thing here is kind of, this is the revitalization planning process to get that plan. And then you can strategize, you can sequence and think about that depending on whether you are specifically lining this up with a funding application this year or next year through one of these specific programs. So I didn't.
Great. So thank you all for sticking with us here with our last New York Forward webinar. Before we get into any questions here, I just want to remind everyone that these webinars, today's included, have all been recorded and will be posted on our New York Forward website. We do have a question here, which I'll read off in just a minute, but if anybody else has any questions, please put those in the chat box. And with that, so we have received one question, and I'll read it off here. When you discussed the who of project implementation, you didn't mention the consulting team and project manager from DOS that communities will be paired with, according to the New York Forward overview. Do they just help with the initial planning and then hand the planning work over to the community for project implementation? Could you clarify the DOS consulting team and project manager roles? Yes. So once a community is awarded, we go through a 7-month planning process to create the strategic investment plan, which can be equated with the revitalization plan we're discussing here today. So the community will work with a consultant that has been selected by DOS to prepare this revitalization plan. The DOS project manager will ensure that all program goals and intentions are met, all the requirements of the program, and information needed in the SIP is provided. But that process is primarily driven by the community, which a local planning committee will be established for the plan to guide the plan. And then the process is really shepherded and conducted by the consultant. Once you go through the development of that plan, and projects have been awarded, contracts may be held either by the Department of State or our partner agencies, Empire State Development or the New York State Office of Homes and Community Renewal, HCR. The project manager in the respective agency will monitor project implementation, and for public projects, DOS will most likely be the contracting agency assigned to the project. And then I'll also just say that if you're interested in seeing how the process plays out a little bit more, you might be interested in reviewing our program guidebook. This kind of takes you step by step through the SIP planning process. And then there's also a subsequent chapter on project implementation as well. And so if there are any other questions, we'll give it a few just more moments here and see if those pop into the chat. All right, well, seeing none, thank you all for joining us throughout this series, and best of luck to you all. Thanks.